And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Thank you for joining us for the marine portion of this broadcast. I'm meteorologist Emily Niebuhr. Let's take a look at our sea ice edge. You can see, again, pretty ice-free waters across portions of the Chukchi Sea. Again, light blue indicates less than 80% concentration of sea ice, but this doesn't really indicate thickness. White indicates greater than 80% concentration of sea ice. So again, Kaktovik is sitting in ice-free waters. Ukjavik still has a lot of high sea ice concentration offshore, and Prudhoe Bay is starting to open up a little bit across the area. Let's take a look at some of these weather systems that are going to be impacting your marine activities for this weekend. So we have a low pressure system in the Bristol Bay area moving across Kodiak Island today. We have nice high pressure sitting across the panhandle, keeping some of those showers at bay. Saturday, that low pressure system in its front, it stretches all across the state, is going to continue to drift slowly to the east and slowly away from Kodiak Island. Meanwhile, we have a new low pressure system moving in towards Shemya on Saturday. By Sunday, high pressure is well in place across Bristol Bay area, and that low pressure system and its front is impacting the central Bering Sea. Then meanwhile, we have this low pressure system is slowly moving in towards the panhandle. So let's take a look at your Saturday marine forecast, important for the interiors of the panhandle. Again, we're looking at waves of around 2 to 4 feet in the interior areas and winds about 10 to 20 knots, with, of course, higher seas and waves in channel terrain. As we go along the the Gulf Coast, we're looking at waves of 2 to 5 feet and winds about 10 to 20 knots. Sunday, we see waves a little calmer in the interior region, only about 3-foot waves expected near Ketchikan. But again, 2 to foot waves and winds about 10 to 15 knots. As we go out into the Gulf area, we have waves about generally 4 feet and winds 10 to 15 knots. As we go towards the North Gulf Coast, again, the greatest waves are going to be channeled through between Kodiak Island and the southern Kenai Peninsula, with about waves about 4 feet and winds about 20 knots. So definitely as you come out of Homer, expect higher waves and seas as you go south. Along with the rest of Cook Inlet, we're looking at waves about generally 2 feet, winds about 10 knots. As we go into Prince William Sound, we have winds about 10 knots and waves 2 feet. And along the along the Gulf Coast, we're looking at waves of 2 to 4 feet, winds 10 to 15 knots. For Sunday, again, we're still expecting this jet of wind across the southern portions of Cook Inlet. And so we're looking at winds about 10 to 25 knots, waves of 4 to 5 feet. In the interior parts of Cook Inlet, we're looking at winds of 10 knots, waves 2 feet. Along the Gulf Coast, we're looking at winds of 10 knots, waves 3 to 4 feet, and still sheltered in Prince William Sound for your Sunday, about waves 2 feet, winds 10 knots. For Saturday, along the Bristol Bay area, we're looking at as the frontal system moves south of the area, the strongest winds and waves are going to be to the southeast of Kodiak Island. Winds of about 25 knots, waves 4 to 7 feet. As we go further west, we're looking at waves closer to 2 to 4 feet generally in the Bristol Bay area, 3 to 4 feet, and winds calmer as you go further west, closer to 15 knots. Sunday, we continue to see those winds and waves diminish off of Kodiak, so waves of 3 to 4 feet instead, and winds of about 15 knots. And generally calmer conditions as well along the Alaska Peninsula. Remember, this is when the high pressure system moves into the area. So we're expecting waves of about 2 to 3 feet and winds about 10 to 15 knots. For Saturday, you can tell this is where our low pressure system that we were talking about moving into the Western Aleutian. So associated with that front, we are definitely going to see higher winds and waves in the Western Aleutian Islands. So we're looking at 7 to 8 feet across the area and winds of about 25 knots. As you go further east, we're looking at winds of about 20 knots, waves around 4 feet. Sunday, conditions calm down as that low pressure system moves further to the east and to the north. So generally, even near Shemya, waves only about 4 feet, winds about 10 knots. And then as you go eastward towards the central and eastern Aleutians, we're looking at 25 to 20 knot winds, waves about 3 to 6 feet. As we go towards Bristol Bay, near the Pribilof Islands, we're expecting waves of about 4 feet, winds of about 15 knots. In Bristol Bay, winds about 20 knots, waves 3 feet. As we go towards Hooper Bay, again, waves 3 feet, winds 15 knots, and up towards Nome, 15 knots, waves 3 feet. For Sunday, waves and wind conditions similar across the Pribilofs, although again, we have that little stronger winds to the west if you're intending to go to the west of the Pribilof Islands. But generally, waves of about 2 feet along Bristol Bay, winds 10 knots. You go north towards Nome, winds of about 15 knots, waves 3 feet. As you go towards the Arctic coast for your Saturday, we're expecting along the north waves 2 to 3 feet in ice-free waters and winds of about 10 to 15 knots. And as you go towards Seward Peninsula, again, generally winds of about 15 knots, waves 3 feet. Similar conditions on Sunday. Ubiquitously 3-foot waves, winds of about 10 to 15 knots across the area.